Morning, everyone. We're going to be talking about productivity this morning. And the reason for talking about productivity, even though it's not going to be talking about like any one creature in particular, is that productivity sets up the entire food web that each of your creatures are going to experience. And remember that part of this project is to build out the food web for your creatures. So just want to understand what's behind that and what energy transfers are happening through that food web. So primary productivity has to do with anything that photosynthesizes food or chemosynthesizes food. So remember, photosynthesis is sunlight, using sunlight to make food. Chemosynthesis is using chemicals to make food. So we have photosynthesis that occurs up in the upper portion of the ocean in the euphotic zone. And then our chemosynthetic organisms are our ones that live down by hydrothermal vents. Obviously, there's no sunlight down there, and so they use the chemicals coming out of the hydrothermal vents to make their food instead. And this represents about 99.9% of the ocean's biomass. Everything relying directly or indirectly on photosynthesis for food. So chemosynthetic organisms are very small in percentage. Almost everybody in the ocean has a photosynthetic creature at the bottom of their food web or at the base of their food web. So we have photosynthesis and respiration, just a quick review from bio. So we have our energy coming in from sunlight, photosynthesizing food, creating sugar and oxygen gas. Then we have respiration that combines that sugar and that oxygen gas to produce energy, and then it releases carbon dioxide into the water. So we get this exhaling of carbon dioxide just like we do from humans, from our creatures as well. So we measure productivity in the ocean. It's something that we keep a really close eye on because it tells us what life is like in the ocean, because again, every base of every food web is a photosynthetic organism or two or three. And so measuring our productivity tells us what life is going to be able to be supported in the ocean. So we can directly measure it using plankton nets. And then we can also measure radioactive carbon in seawater. Again, since carbon is being exhaled, so to speak, into the water, we can measure that carbon to see how much of that is happening. These are some examples of plankton nets. Actually, we did this when I was sailing twice a day, at noon and at midnight, and our net was a little bit different, but basically you drag it for an hour, and you capture in the bottom all of your planktonic organisms, preserve those, and then you take a spoonful, just a regular old spoonful, and you look at it under the microscope like this, and you do what's called a 100 count. And you basically count and identify the first 100 organisms that you see. And that gives you a sense of what is in that area that you just towed through. We also have some other indirect measurements using satellite systems. And then also we'll monitor the ocean color. So photosynthetic phytoplankton use a green pigment called chlorophyll, just like plants do. So areas where the ocean is more green in color indicate a higher level of productivity. We also have SeaWIFS satellite sensor, and that does ocean color. And then we have MODIS, which measures ocean color and also helps us understand currents. Not currents. This is what is currently used, The reason why is because it has a really, really specific color frequency that it can measure, color frequency range that it can measure. So it's a much wider range than what we had with SeaWIFS. In order for productivity to take off, you have to have nutrient availability. and we have nitrate, phosphorus, and iron and silica that we need in order to support productivity. Most of that comes from river runoff, and we talked about that in our nutrient pollution, how we're actually getting too much nutrient, and that's creating your eutrophication, and your dead zones along the coasts. And so productivity is most high along your continental margins because that's where your rivers are running off into the ocean. We have what's called the Redfield ratio, and this tells us the ratio of carbon to nitrate to phosphorus that's ideal for productivity, that doesn't overgrow everything, but well supports the food webs and the productivity needed for the area. And again, that's called the Redfield ratio. Nitrates and phosphates are what are washed into our coastal areas and causing eutrophication. Again, we did a whole thing on this, so I'm gonna, you guys know about dead zones and eutrophication and what that is causing. So we also need solar radiation. So if we are not receiving enough sunlight, then you're not gonna be as productive. We know that the uppermost surface and shallow seafloor are where we receive the most radiation, so the euphotic zone, the top 100 meters, and that's where we have enough light for photosynthesis. So all of our photosynthesis takes place in the top 100 meters depth of the ocean. At the compensation depth, your net photosynthesis becomes zero. The word net here means that there is some that goes on, but you're also losing ability at that point. And so you really don't have any net benefit from photosynthesis at that level. Light transmission into the ocean water, it is what we need, obviously, for photosynthesis. But when we look at visible light, which is the portion of the spectrum that we see, we understand that blue wavelengths penetrate the deepest into the ocean. That's why the ocean looks blue. Your longer wavelengths of red and orange are absorbed first. So this is why we don't see those colors when we look at the ocean. The same is true for why the sky is blue. And so what we see here is that your longer wavelengths, you can see we have all of the visible light colors. This is why you can see colored fish. If you go snorkeling or scuba diving, you can see the colors of the fish at this top level, top depth. And then once you get down into the lower depth, down about 10 meters, your reds and your oranges are starting to be absorbed. And so it's just not, your shorter wavelength colors are still visible. And again, even deeper down to the end of the euphotic zone, really blue is the only one that's left. And so that is why the ocean looks blue. But it's also why we can use green, because if green is present and if the ocean is looking green, we know that it's not because we're seeing green light. It's got to be something else in the ocean. We use a Secchi disc to measure the color, and so that's one physical measurement that we can do in the ocean. It measures the water's transparency, and so if we can, we basically just lower it in the ocean and we count the depth at which we lose sight of it. So if we are losing sight of it early, then we have not clear water. And so that could be runoff, sediment from runoff that's suspended in the water, or it could be your photosynthetic organisms being so abundant in that area that you're not seeing it, that it's actually thickening the water and making it less clear. You have coastal areas of upwelling are your super productive area because we have the availability of nutrients and we have our shallower water where our sunlight can be used for photosynthesis. And so these are our eutrophic areas and often are lighter green. Coastal water sailors are called green water sailors. And then your open ocean is not productive. And so it's called oligotrophic, and that's why it's dark blue. Open ocean sailors are called blue water sailors. So it has to do with shallow versus deep. Your ocean margins are obviously rich in life because of all of these things. And that's even despite all of these stressors. So shallow water depths allow for greater seasonal temperature variations and salinity variations, and yet we still see more abundant life in that area. The water column varies in thickness due to tides, and yet we still see more abundant life in that area. The breaking waves release large amounts of energy, and yet we still see more abundant life. And so it's just really interesting how resilient those creatures have become in those areas to still maintain life. You can see this is a SeaWIFS image. So you can see the different ocean color. You can see the deep, deep blue is going to represent areas that are not productive, but then areas where we experience upwelling, so along the Peru current, along the side here. Remember, we talked about our Peru fishery, anchovy fishery that's affected by El Nino really badly. Super highly productive area. Another high area of productivity over here off the west coast of Africa. And then we have a really high level of productivity up here off of the east coast of the US and Canada. These are the Grand Banks. This is the Grand Banks fishery up here. So these are your areas of upwelling and also nutrient production, off the coast. Upwelling allows those nutrients to come up in areas where we aren't receiving enough runoff, and typically they're on the western continental margin. So you can see western continental margin over here, highly productive, western continental margin over here, highly productive, western continental margin over here, highly productive. This is kind of an outlier right here, why we have such a high productive area off the coast of off the east coast of the US and Canada. So our upwelling and our nutrient supply is super important to pay attention to, because if your creature lives in that area, that's going to impact what your food web looks like, because it's highly, highly productive and your creature probably eats several different things. So just kind of keep that in mind. That is that for today. Remember that every single day you should be embedding this information into your presentation in some way, how it relates to your creature. This probably isn't going to directly relate to your creature yet, but after we have our lectures on Monday, it will be better understood how that's going to play in directly toward your creature. And what we're gearing up toward is creating your food web for your creature. So make sure you take the time to really go back through these lectures from this week and start getting all of that information gathered for your creature specifically, and get it put into your presentation so you've got that ready to go. We're going to hit food webs pretty hard next week, so that's kind of what you're going to be spending your time researching next week, is what does the food web for your creature look like. I'll be on twice a day still at 10 and 3 for help, especially when it gets to creating the food web. So let me know what I can do for you, and I hope you guys have a great day.